Training camp has started and football season is about here. So let's talk a little bit about Purdue football. The basketball team has graciously given us about a 2 week hiatus from a lot of basketball activities. Haven't gotten a lot of content out of them recently, so we figured it was a great time to kind of preview what this Purdue football team could look like. It's going to be a pretty new look roster, I think, even though there are a couple of pieces that will be some familiar faces, and certainly there's no turnover on the staff, which is very nice, of course, but still a lot of new faces. So I will throw it over to Ethan first. I think we're going to go position group by position group, but he's the football guy here, so I'll let him kick it off.
Well, you said no turnover on the staff. We have the same head coach. We do have two new coordinators. Let's not forget. New offensive coordinator and I guess new defensive coordinator is a bit of a stretch, but Kevin Kane is back after a year away from the program. The old DC under he who shall not be named, let's just say. But yeah, let's talk about this Purdue roster a little bit, because after last season's disappointing 2-win finish, I think Purdue fans, myself included, are hoping for a more competitive team. Purdue was easily the worst team in the power conferences last year, and progress would be being better than that. So let's talk about how much better. Ryan Brown is back at quarterback. This will be his third year in the program, one spring dalliance with Bill Belichick aside. He is entering his second season as the starter, and he wasn't great last year. The numbers won't jump off the page. A little over 2,000 passing yards, only 9 touchdowns. But there were games where Purdue's offense was really dynamic, moving up and down the field, and he's a big part of why. When he's in a rhythm, he can really throw it, and he adds a mobility option that Purdue hasn't had in their starters in recent years. So, the backup quarterbacks look to be pretty underwhelming right now. But Brown at least has some promise. What are you expecting out of him in year 2 as the starter?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm just expecting a little bit more consistency. I don't know. I don't think the arm is ever really going to get to a point where he's just like a prolific deep ball guy, and I felt like his accuracy problems in the short passing game were largely overblown a little bit, and so I think this is a guy who you just hope gets a little bit more consistent in the decision making, takes care of the ball a little bit better, and I think ideally probably is playing with a little bit more consistent receiver group and offensive line group as well. And I think he's a real dual threat quarterback at this point, and that's kind of a dimension of the offense that Purdue hasn't really had. But it gives you a little bit of excitement, because I think there's a little bit of a lot of different things you can do with this offense and have some success.
Yeah, I think there's a lot that can be expected of Brown in year 2. I'd like to see him use his mobility to his advantage a little bit more. Times last year, it felt like he was kind of a statue in the pocket unless he was like purposely getting out on the move and really committed to scrambling. So, maybe some improvements to Purdue's offensive line. We'll talk about them here in a second. I can give him a little bit more of a stable platform. And I think he can be a very good, like, middle field intermediate passer. He's got some zip on the ball, like when he's throwing into those windows, even though his deep ball arm really isn't there. So I think, improving the timing with his receivers and getting a little bit more comfortable in this offense could be big for him. Let's talk about running back. I think probably the strongest position offensively for Purdue, depending on what you think of Ryan Brown. The depth is definitely better, at least than on quarterback. Purdue's starter is expected to be Fame Ijiboy from Minnesota, transferred in from Minnesota, who actually led the Golden Gophers in rushing last year, was better than their projected NFL draft pick, Darius Taylor. But it's not just him. Antonio Harris, Purdue fans will remember him from last year as a fun change of pace back. He's back. Jarrett Gibson, Travis Terrell Jr. could also be involved here. What do you think Purdue's rushing attack could look like this year with those guys kind of leading it?
I think it's a pretty dynamic group, which is pretty exciting. And as much as I love Devin Mockabee, it's nice to have a little bit of depth there and have other options that you feel good about rather than only Devin Mockabee. And I think Ijiboy is good enough to fill the Mockabee void too. Like, this is a pretty high level back, and honestly This is one of the better transfers that Purdue football has gotten, period, since really portal season has opened up in any sport. And it's really exciting. I mean, I can't honestly think of the last time that Purdue was able to pull in a guy out of the portal with no connection to Purdue that has that level of production at a power conference school. I mean, this is a pretty highly rated transfer here in Ojibwe, and it makes me excited. I think if the offensive line is solid, this is a guy who is a really physical runner, will wear down defenses, and I think the backfield is definitely the strength of this Purdue team. Whether or not you put the emphasis on the quarterback or the halfback, I think you have a pretty capable starter at both of those positions.
Yeah, I'm really excited about Edge Boys specifically, but also the running backs in general. Just to be clear, his production, like box stats, were a little bit worse. He was than Darius Taylor. He was the backup last year. His PFF grading was better, and I get those confused sometimes. Excuse me. But he was really productive. Averaged 4.5 yards per carry, 3 total touchdowns. He got 12 passes last year as well. So there's some versatility in the passing game. He's listed at 6 foot, 210 pounds. He is a big back, can really run between tackles, but can also, hit the seams on the outside. And like I said, has some versatility in the passing game. So I'm pretty excited to see what he can do. But let's move on to the skill position, guys. Wide receivers and tight ends. Purdue, unfortunately, last week got some bad news in the injury front. Kylan Fox, the UCF transfer tight end, was expected to be Purdue's tight end 2 behind George Burhen. He has a knee injury that will sideline him for the 2026 season. So hopefully he gets back healthy and can contribute the following year. But it's pretty much just the George Burhen show at tight end. There's really not much behind him anymore, which is concerning. Not just because tight ends are an important part of modern offenses, but also Burhen's had his own injury issues in the past. If he goes down, Purdue really doesn't have any experience at all behind him. So that's a potential concern. But there are some interesting wide receivers on this team, probably none more so than Nylon Morissette, who was a big-time transfer last year, who was unable to play due to injury, but he's back, expected to lead Purdue's wide receiver room. BC Owens is more of a speed guy who had a lot of production at Penn last year, an up transfer from the FCS. Assad Wasim is another potential contributor, as is Xavier Townsend, Jesse Watson, Chauncey Magwood. There are a lot of guys here who could be, potential contributors. Tramar Harris, Jaleel Hall. So a lot of names, but not a lot of proven production outside of Owens and Morissette, who are kind of expected to be the leaders of this group. What should Purdue fans expect from their wide receivers?
I think you're going to see kind of a revolving door of wide receivers. If I had to guess, I'd bet at least 5 or 6 of these guys get consistent reps. And I don't necessarily know if that's a bad thing, because I think a lot of these guys bring a little bit of something different to the wide receiver position than their own counterparts. And so I am pretty excited because I think it's a more veteran group than the last couple of years have been. You're going to have 3 guys that have a lot of experience probably headlining this group in BC Owens, or Nylon Morissette, and Keen was Dean. I think it's going to be a good group. I think it's going to be a more consistent group, and that's probably a good thing, especially considering the struggles that we've seen from wide receiver group, especially last year with dropping football.
Yeah, I think it's an unproven group, but there's some potential here. Burhead is reliable and productive when he's healthy, so fingers crossed he's able to stay on the field, because I think he's going to be a really big part of Purdue's passing game if he is. I think you can see a lot of Purdue's offense run through their backs as well. Like I said, Purdue really only has 2 proven producers at the college level in Owens and Morissette. Morissette missed all of last year. Owens is transferring from the Ivy League, so there's a chance Purdue doesn't really have a true number 1 option at the Big Ten level at wide receiver, which could still be fine if the backs are as good as we think they could be if Burhen's able to stay healthy. So it could be a little bit like last year, where as the season went on, Purdue just ran more and more of their offense through Maccabee and Harris and their backs, because they weren't getting what they wanted from the wide receivers. But hopefully, like you said, the drop issues last year were a problem. Reliability and consistency were issues. So even if Purdue's receiving weapons aren't quite as theoretically dynamic as they were a year ago, they can more than make up for that in reliability. And if you're not catching the football, there's only so much all that speed can do. So there's definitely some hope there for the wide receiver core. But let's talk about the offensive line. It was the big weakness on offense for Purdue last year. We'll see what it looks like this year. Sounds like two guys have really stabilized their starting spots. Joey Tanona returns at left tackle. He started there for Purdue last year. And then a transfer from Troy, who also played at South Carolina, is Boaz Stanley at center. Those two guys have kind of locked in their spots, but there's a lot of moving pieces elsewhere. Micah Banulos at left guard, Marquise Easley at right guard, and Nuku Mafi at right tackle are the guys who were there in the spring. But shout out Dustin Deschutti from Purdue on SI. Sounds like those three guys are not locking down starting spots, at least early in fall camp. There's a lot of competition there, a lot of potential turnover. How worried should Purdue fans be about this? And, is there hope for what this offensive line could look like in year 2 under Mariota?
I think there is real hope. We talked about it a little bit offline. At minimum, like Tanona and Boaz Stanley are the two guys that you look at this offensive line group and say, well, they have to produce. They have to be good for this offensive line group to have a chance. And on the bright side, like those two guys seem to be the ones that are standing out and consistently being the ones who perform every day. The concerning thing is does this mean that there are like 6 other guys that are capable of fighting for a starting spot, or are there nobody else that's really all that good enough to separate from anybody and be worthy of a starting spot? I think that's the big question here that we don't know, because there's so many new faces. I think Marquise Easley is probably the one out of that group that I would say is the most likely to start, but quite honestly, it sounds like it's still really up in the air. So I don't know. I do think this group will be better than last year, but that's a pretty low bar.
Yeah, so I mean, Easley is a Georgia transfer. There's potential for him to kind of step into a role with that pedigree. Ironically, he and another former Purdue player, Georgia transfer, made news together about 2 years ago. They were both arrested for speeding, him and Nitro Tuggle, while they were at Georgia together. So keeping the Bulldogs football tradition alive. But he, like you said, he's probably the highest floor guy of that group, and you're hoping that he kind of establishes himself. Nuku Mafi, the massive offensive tackle, Oklahoma State transfer. He had some other suitors as well. Purdue kind of want to battle for him in the portal. So I still have hope for him as well. And if those two guys step up, I think Purdue can handle a bit of a revolving door at that 4th or that 5th offensive line spot. But if Purdue's going to have question marks at 3 of their spots on the offensive line, that's a huge red flag for any team, but especially a team like Purdue that's really going to be struggling to produce on offense if they can't block anyone. So, like you said, I think there's hope here, but Purdue needs some guys to step up and start producing in fall camp and really establish themselves as reliable starters on the offensive line. We're only a week in, so there's no need to press the panic button yet, but 2 weeks from now, if Purdue is still a little unsettled on the offensive line, I'd be a little bit worried about what that means. Before we move on to the defensive side of the ball, any last thoughts on the offense? How good do you think this offense can be?
I think there's a world where this offense can actually be like a top half of the Big Ten offense. I don't think that's that insane to say. It's the rate limiting step here is definitely going to be the offensive line, but I think there's a world the offensive line is good enough that it allows, I think, a pretty talented skill group between Ryan Brown at quarterback and then all the talent you have at running back. And I think a pretty deep wide receiver room that has a bunch of different guys that I think have the ability to break out and have a big year. So I think there's a world where this offense is pretty good and is very competitive with some of the middle kind of like 2nd, 3rd tier Big Ten teams, I think.
I agree. I think Purdue has the potential to be pretty explosive offensively. You and I were kind of talking about this offline, but Ryan Brown feels like a potential breakout guy at quarterback. Like in the right environment, he could be extremely productive at the college level, even if it doesn't always look pretty. And he kind of has that skill set, that dual threat capability. a good enough arm to push the ball downfield. So, like I kind of mentioned throughout this video, I'm really excited for what our running backs can do. And if Purdue's able to piece together a good enough offensive line, our rushing attack could be pretty potent. And I'd be more comfortable with a passing attack kind of built off of a strong running game than the reverse. Like if Purdue's struggling to run the football, I think I suddenly get really worried about how much onus is going to be put on Brown's arm and these wide receivers to carry the offense. But if Purdue is running the ball, then all of a sudden Morissette and Owens and all these guys can kind of take advantage of the defense, pack in the box a little bit more, and find themselves open. And I think that could be really exciting development for Purdue.
You know who Ryan Brown reminds me of a little bit? Like an off-brand Riley Leonard. And now Riley Leonard was probably a little better than Ryan Brown will ever be in college, and also is on an NFL roster. I'm not sure Ryan Brown ever gets to that point, but when you're talking about like the dual threat quarterback that's athletic but doesn't have like freakish speed or evasiveness, like Brown isn't a guy that's going to go make three people miss, but he's quick enough to get out of the pocket. I think has a good enough arm, and just is a little bit of has that gamer archetype to him. I feel like I think there's a little bit of Riley Leonard there.
I don't hate it. The big difference, Leonard had a very good college arm. That made him like when he was a Duke before he transferred anywhere, like he was a like potential first round draft prospect. Obviously didn't pan out that way, ends up going in the 7th round after a national champion runner up season at Notre Dame. I think that's the big difference between a guy like Ryan Brown and where Riley Leonard ended up going in his career. But I don't hate it, especially from a rushing standpoint. I think they do kind of, I mean, Leonard's bigger. I don't think Brown is going to be used as a battering ram quite like Leonard was at Notre Dame at times, especially in the red zone. But I kind of see the vision when they're in the open field. They're not really like making anyone miss. They're just kind of taking the yards that are there a little bit faster than you'd expect for someone their size, and kind of keeping defenses honest with how they defend the quarterback run.
Yeah, let's move into the defense a little bit, though. I think this is probably the rate limiting step for how good this football team is, and I think if the defense is anything like last year, we're probably going to have a couple of games where it's shootout. Like Purdue's probably going to be able to move the football against most of the teams on their schedule, outside of a couple of the really, really good ones. We'll get to the schedule predictions, but there's probably going to be a couple games where Purdue also cannot stop the other team, which lead to some heart attack inducing games that are also incredibly fun to watch. So how do you think this defense shakes out? Where do you want to start?
Let's start on the defensive line here because Purdue has a relatively thin but promising group of edge rushers. CJ Madden is back. It feels like he's like a breakout candidate every single year, and when that happens, you probably at some point have to stop expecting the breakout. But at minimum, he's going to be one of your more reliable pieces along the defensive line. I like his potential there. He's got the size, he's got the speed. Like, if you're looking for like an impact pass rusher, he's probably the guy to circle. And then Keyshawn Burgos, Virginia Tech transfer, go Hokies. But he's also like a Power 5 transfer who has a reliable track record of production. I think Purdue's floor is higher at the edge rusher spots than it was a year ago. I don't know what the ceiling is here. Elo Medozi is still there. There are a few other guys who could, be contributors. Breon Ishmael, Jeremy Lewis, Trey Smith maybe. But for the most part, I think it's going to be those three guys in Burgos, Madden, and Medozi who are kind of looked to as the main guys that are starting. And then on the interior of the defensive line, it's pretty much a two-man group there with Kurt Neal and TJ Lindsey. The starters feel pretty set there. Purdue's a little deeper on the interior. They got guys like Elijah St. John, Winston Sims, Rodney Laura, Jordan Creed could maybe contribute. But the starters are pretty set here. Any thoughts on the defensive line?
Yeah, I think this is definitely the strength of this defense, is this defensive line. And I don't know how great this team is going to be at stopping the run, but I actually feel pretty good about the pass rush. I think Kurt Neal is definitely going to be one of the more impactful transfers, I think, on this football team, just in how you feel his impact, because I think that's an instant upgrade in the middle to stopping the run, and will probably be a big help. And probably help out a guy like Charles Correa, who's been a pretty consistent tackler throughout his career. And if Kurt Neal, I think, can apply some pressure in the middle of the interior defensive line, I think that opens it up for a guy like him who, at minimum is going to be a plus tackler and create a lot of opportunities for this linebacker group. And I think on the edge, it's a pretty high ceiling group. These guys have all kind of struggled with consistency, and the Georgia guys never found the field at Georgia, but they have the athletic tools to be like a pretty awesome edge rusher group. And I think you really circle those three guys as like any one of those three, I think, pop off and have a really big game or give a certain offensive tackle trouble. And that is a big thing for Purdue. I think it would really help Purdue's defense. And, if Purdue can at least get pressure on passing downs, I think the defense would be manageable. And all of a sudden you start to talk yourself into, well, maybe if the offense is as good as we think it is, the defense just has to be solid, and this team could still win 5-6 games even. And I think there's a world that happens. And I think if the defense is going to be good, it's going to be built off the pass rush.
Yeah, I'm with you on that one. I think I'm excited. I think Purdue's edge rushers are more the ceiling plays. Their tackles are more the floor plays, if that makes sense. Like Kurt Neal, Illinois transfer, he is going to be a staple starter. I don't think you really have to worry about him. Madden, Mendoza, and Burgos are all really high ceiling athletic edge rushers. And if one of those guys breaks out into like an all Big Ten caliber player, suddenly you feel way, way better about that defense. Let's move on to the linebackers here, because there are some really interesting names here. The biggest of which is Charles Correa, who was kind of Purdue's breakout linebacker last year. Always in the backfield, very inconsistent. I got on here and I broke down some of his plays and miscues and stuff and kind of talked about the issues he was contributing to Purdue's defense. But what was undeniable was he was always around the football, making big plays when Purdue needed him on defense. And he's back for his junior season and now has a full year of starting under his belt. So really, sky's the limit for him. Winston Berglund is also back, another returning starter. But it's two transfers in JoJo Hayden from Illinois and Trey Moore as well, who might have the inside track to start. Jackson Ott is an interesting freshman to keep an eye on. What are your thoughts on this linebacker group?
Yeah, I mean, Trey Moore originally came to Purdue in the portal as an edge rusher from San Diego, which I believe is an FCS program. But I think there's some real, linebackery things there, and he's pretty athletic. He's pretty undersized too for an edge rusher. He's 6'5", but only like 215. It does make me curious, like, could this Purdue team go to like a 5-man front every once in a while and put Trey Moore on the edge there and see what that looks like? JoJo Hayden, though, I think looks a little bit different than like the typical Purdue linebackers. He's just bigger. That's a 245-pound linebacker that I think is going to add a lot of physicality to a group that, no offense to Charles Correa and Winston Berglund last year, I don't think we're the biggest, most physical group of linebackers. And I think JoJo Hayden immediately brings that level of physicality and that size to that linebacker group that I think can be the yin to Charles Correa's yang there, as he's more of that athletic, tackler type.
I'm with you there. I think Correa and Hayden can be just really fun combination, and I'm curious to see what Moore can do. You said transfer edge rusher. They're kind of converting to a linebacker. He's definitely listed at 225, which is small for a Power 5 edge rusher, so it makes sense to move him off ball. But his pass rushing upside, kind of along with Correa's, is really intriguing to me. Let's round things out with the secondary. Purdue has a couple of returning starters. Kadari Hines ended up starting in the slot down the stretch last season, like the second half of the year. He's back, presumably to fill the same role. Smiley Bradford was a really big-time transfer last year, kind of Purdue's like biggest transfer. He had a very up-and-down season. Maybe in year two he can establish himself as a little bit more of a consistent starter on the outside. And then rounding out the cornerback room is one Mr. Clark. Literally, it's just his name, Mr. Clark. That is not a title I'm giving him. He is Mr. Clark, which is going to be really fun when he's a little bit older. those are probably your corners. The safety room is a little bit more in flux, but Jaden Mangum probably has the inside track to start at one. The other spot might be filled by like a John Slaughter or Damon Marable, something like that. Hines can also play safety, so it's possible he just fills the safety role and plays a linebacker in the slot. So anything jump off the page to you with the secondary group?
I don't know what to expect from the secondary group. I think it'll be a solid secondary group. Like I'm starting to talk myself into that group combined with a much improved pass rush, probably like is a pretty solid backbone of a defense. I just I think my biggest questions with this defense don't really come in the passing game. It comes in how this team stops the run, because I think that was this team's biggest issue last year. And if this team isn't capable of putting anybody behind the sticks in the run game, it doesn't matter how good their passing defense is. And I think the secondary should be pretty solid. I do think that the biggest improvement potentially for this roster from last year is the safety group. Like I think the safeties last year were really, really bad at times. And I think Mangum is probably the best of the new group. And I think that's a pretty impactful safety back there. And I like a lot of the different ads that could potentially play safety. Mr. Clark's a guy who has a lot of safety experience from FIU. I kind of trust this group, and this feels like this will be one of the more consistent groups I think on the roster is the secondary this year. I'm not sure if it's going to be like a special group performance wise, if they're going to turn a lot of heads, but I think you're probably going to get some pretty decent consistent production from this group.
I agree. You mentioned the defensive line as a strength of the defense. I think it's the secondary. I think this group is deep. They have length and speed they didn't have a year ago. I'm excited with what these guys can be. Now, a guy like Bradford is going to have to play better than he did a year ago, but when he is maybe the third best player in your secondary instead of the guy who's supposed to be the star, I think that takes some pressure off of him, and I think that puts into context how much better this group is than it was a year ago as well. Real quick on the specialists here, Dylan Drennan, Buffalo transfer, second team All-MAC guy. He's going to be the punter. And Purdue has a kicker battle with three guys who have never made a field goal in college. Seth Turner was the kickoff specialist a year ago, never attempted a field goal. So don't really have any updates for you there. Three guys who are going to be competing for what could be a real rough kicking job if none of them emerge. But that's kind of the down low on the specialists. Real quick, let's take a brief look at the schedule because Purdue in the Big Ten, no more divisions, 9 conference games, at a conference game against Notre Dame. It's going to be a tough schedule with very, very few winnable games on it with where Purdue is as a program right now. They open the season on Friday, September 4th, so a little over 3 weeks away from when we're recording this, or a little less than 3 weeks away, I should say. But Indiana State is the FCS team that Purdue plays this year. They'll be double-digit favorites in that game. That's immediately followed by a home game against Wake Forest, a bowl team from a year ago. So that'll be a tough out-of-conference matchup. After that, Purdue travels to UCLA and then gets Notre Dame at home, followed by at Illinois, home against Minnesota and Washington, at Penn State, home against Maryland, at Iowa, home against Wisconsin, at Indiana. Gauntlet of a Big Ten schedule, even though we avoid the likes of Michigan and Ohio State and Oregon. Any schedule thoughts here? Games you expect Purdue to win? What record do you think they might have by the end of this?
Yeah, this is a really tough schedule, just straight up. I mean, and quite honestly, you're not going to find many teams around the country that play 11 power conference games. That just, in today's day and age, you don't see that very often. Most schools are playing one. And very few will play 2. A lot of them will play none, too, if you look at some schools. I'm looking at one directly to the south. But with that, I do think that you made the point, like it's a pretty tough Big Ten schedule, but they avoid largely all of the, like, dominant programs, I think. Really outside of Indiana, this team avoids all of the other elite Big Ten teams, which is kind of a break a little bit. And it also, I think, means almost every game on the schedule is winnable. Like that there's going to be a lot of tough games, and there's not really any surefire wins outside of Indiana State. But I think largely outside of the Indiana and maybe the Notre Dame games, probably every other game on the schedule is winnable. Even though you look at like an at Penn State, that's going to be a really tough game, but that's like a top 25-ish team, not like a top 5 to top 10 team like you're looking at Ohio State or an Oregon. So I do think that there's a world where if this Purdue team hits kind of their ceiling on offense and defense and has some close game luck, right? Like this could be a 6 to 7 win team in like a perfect season, but I think I'm expecting more like 4.
Yeah, just to kind of break down where Purdue's opponents stand. You mentioned Indiana, obviously defending national champs. Unlikely they'll be quite as good as they were a year ago, but that's still a top 10 team. I have no concerns about Kurt Signetti winning a lot of games in the Big Ten. Notre Dame, top 5 team preseason, the best team on Purdue's schedule on paper. Someone who covers the NFL and does a lot of draft scouting. That team is loaded with NFL talent, both sides of the ball. That could be a 60-point loss for Purdue if they wanted it to be. Outside of that, like you said, there's some top 25 teams. Illinois and Iowa are both going to be top 25 teams. Penn State and Washington both could be as well. But those are not, top 10 unwinnable games. But if Purdue isn't better than they were a year ago, it won't really matter. They're not competing with a ranked caliber team anyway. The coin flip games, to me, at UCLA, obviously tough getting that on the road, but UCLA is a beatable team for Purdue. Wisconsin at home. I know it's Wisconsin, and I know it's Purdue, but Wisconsin, one of the worst teams in the Big Ten. You get them at home. That there is ironically a chance Purdue ends that losing streak, that 20-plus year losing streak to Wisconsin this season. Maryland, same deal. At home is big. Minnesota, team Purdue has lost to a lot in recent years, but kept it close, kept it competitive. That's another home game. So the good news for Purdue is they get a lot of these swing games at home. The games they're kind of expected to lose, like Illinois, Iowa, Penn State, all on the road. So if you're looking for a path to bowl eligibility here, it's that the coin flip games outside of UCLA all happen at home. You expect to win Indiana State. Wake Forest was a bowl team a year ago, so it's a tough game, but they're not as good as like an Iowa or a Penn State. So that's a game if Purdue is improved, you expect them to be competitive in. There, like you said, there is a path to 6 wins. I think if Purdue gets 4 or 5 wins, that's a huge win for Barry Odom and the staff in year 2. There is a very real chance Purdue only wins 2, maybe 3 games this year, though. Still with arguably the worst roster in the Big Ten, even getting a lot of coin flip games at home. We saw last year Purdue, every coin flip game went against them, even in the close games early in the season against teams they were competitive with. So I think getting to 6 wins would mean winning like every coin flip game and winning an upset, which is difficult for even the best teams in the country to do against teams of their own caliber. So I don't want to put bowl expectations on this team, but I'm a little bit more optimistic than I was a year ago about how good they could be.
Yeah, I mean, I look at this team and I say at October 10th, I think we'll have, we'll know whether or not this team's capable for bowl eligibility. I think you look at that stretch of games and I think this team comes out of the first half of the season at 3-3. You feel pretty solid. Like that would include games against Illinois on the road and against Notre Dame, and would probably mean that you went 2-1 against Wake Forest, UCLA, and Minnesota. And I think that's like kind of what I'm hoping this team can do. And you get to that point, I think all of a sudden bowl eligibility becomes on the table because you look and you say you should be able to beat Maryland and Wisconsin at home at that point. And at that point, why can't we beat Washington at home? It's West Coast team traveling east. Obviously, it's going to be a tough game, but I think when it gets down to that point, all of a sudden, once you make the coin flip games like Washington at home and not like, Wisconsin at home, you feel a lot better about this program and the direction they're heading and chances at bowl eligibility. But I do think there's a world where, like, as you said, coin flip games don't go their way. I mean, there's a world where we look up at that same date on October 10th, and this team's 1-5 because they lost to Wake Forest and Minnesota at home, and they lost on the road to UCLA, and their only wins Indiana State. Like, I do think that's on the table and a possibility for this team.
I agree. You and I were talking offline a little bit about this before we started recording, but Purdue has a new AD. Tommy McClellan comes in. Barry Odom was hired by the previous AD. If Purdue wins 2 games this year, which is very much on the table, like I said, I think this is the worst roster in the Big Ten or very close to it. If Purdue wins 2 games, even 3 games, I do not think his job is secure. I don't know how good a coach Purdue could get, but ADs like to hire their own guys, just like GMs in the professional leagues. When they come in, they want to hire their own guys unless they're given a reason not to. And I do think Odom is auditioning to keep his job this year, even more so than he would be coming off a 2-win season anyway. I think 4 wins makes this a tough decision for the new AD. Fewer than that, I think he's gone. More than that, you can't fire him given the schedule and where Purdue was as a program just as recently as last year. 4 wins is right in that spot, which honestly might be the most likely outcome is 4 wins, at which point it's going to come down to whether he trusts the direction of this program under Barry Odom or if he really wants to make his mark on things and bring his own guy in. But unless you have anything else, I think that pretty much covers it in terms of previewing what this Purdue football season could look like.
Yeah, I think if this Purdue team wins 4 games, I think it's going to really come down to optics on this program. I mean, if this program wins 4 games and loses the final game of the season by 70 in Bloomington, I don't know how you can keep Barry. At the same time, if this team wins 4 games, and that includes like, oh, they got beat by 17 at home to Notre Dame this year and then lost by 21 in Bloomington and, kept it respectable. And this team was competitive even in their like unwinnable games, so to speak, where you're playing a top 5, top 10 team with just a significantly, kind of overwhelmed roster. If you're able to keep it competitive and keep it optically like that, and you still win 4 or 5 games, I think that leads to Barry's job being safe. Before we get out of here, I did want to ask you, what do you think is the best chance for upset? Who's the best team you think Purdue beats this year? I'll let you call your shot.
Best team Purdue beats this year is probably Maryland. I think if I were to project Purdue's record, I would say 2-10 or 3-9 is probably where I would go. I'd take the under on the 3.5 wins. But if we're talking theoretically, I think the best team Purdue could get is Penn State. I think there's a chance Penn State's a lot worse than people expect them to be. But that's more of a gut feeling than I think a realistic shot that even where I think Penn State could win 5 games and miss a bowl game, and they could still beat Purdue by 21.
Yeah, I think my answer to this is Washington. I think this Purdue team gets Washington this year. I don't think that this is one of the better Washington rosters they've had recently, and I'm a big buyer of kind of the coast-to-coast travel really does affect teams. It's why I think this team probably has a good chance to lose against UCLA, just playing that 11 o'clock game on the West Coast. I think the reverse effect might be in store here for this Washington Huskies team as they come east of Purdue. I think this Purdue team gets Washington this year.
Well, we will see. We'll be here on the Boilermaker breakdown to cover Purdue football, however much it deserves this year. We'll be back with some more basketball coverage before you know it. We're in August, season still a few months away. Teams taking kind of their last big break before classes start, and they ought to be back on campus for that in summer practice or in fall practices. But we'll be back next week with more of the Boilermaker breakdown. We'd love it if you would comment, like the video, subscribe. We should really start doing these calls to action at the top of the video so that you don't have to sit through 38 minutes of us rambling about Purdue football to hear it. But for those of you who are still with us, we love you guys. We're growing a Purdue community here, and we really appreciate your support. Thank you, and stay tuned.